Anarcho-capitalism is a political philosophy. It's not a program of action. It's rather a political program. I'm of the mindset that it cannot be done from the state, but it can from the civic society. But to summarize, it's the notion that a society without a state can actually work. That is, it can function and solve its main problems or social needs. And that it is desirable. That would be anarcho-capitalism. From there, we get into other areas. What is justice like? What is health like? What is defense like, etc.? That's the debate. So you wanted me to summarize it, that's it. That this can be done.
What is the main critic that you have towards the state? Why do you think the state is bad?
It is bad because the state claims the illegitimate monopoly of violence. The state is an organization based on the use of violence. More or less organized, more or less explicit, more or less implicit, but it uses violence. I mean, many activities you do, you cannot do them freely. The question is, could there be, or could we think of some type of society that can function without violence? That is the question. People think that anarcho-capitalism is some sort of privatization or wild ultraliberalism or something like that. The main axiom of anarcho-capitalism is peace, that people can reach peaceful and free agreements among themselves in an orderly fashion and without the need of force to be present everywhere. So, from there it derives into everything. The market system is an example of anarchic functioning. It's an example. The basis is that people can relate with each other peacefully. That's the ideal. That's what we are debating. It is also a research program, in the sense that it makes us wonder or study on how to solve a lot of problems, or if they could be solved in a different way, or whether they were solved this way in the past. This is what we are trying to elucidate. Therefore, it's also a theoretical program as well, not only an action program. It is often confused with forming a political party. No, it's basically a philosophical program of action, and if it cannot be, then it cannot be. I have not yet found any conclusive case that says it cannot be done, but if they prove it to me, then I'd have to accept it.
There are also two kinds of libertarians. One, let's say, more progressive, morally wise, and others, let's say, more conservatives or traditionalists. Why do you think society needs to have Christian or traditional values, and not something more progressive?
Because societies have to have moral principles that found them. Normally, religions are allies, not enemies, of anarcho-capitalism, in the sense that they give the moral foundation for societies to work. The Catholic Church is an example. They take care of the sick, of the most vulnerable, etc. It's been carried out privately. If you go to any old Spanish city, you'll see a lot of Catholic churches buildings to help orphans, sick and old people, etc., right? With the means that existed before, not with the means there are today. That is, if that could be done by an infinitely poorer society, what couldn't we do today using those principles? Religion, in that sense, gives us a series of values, a series of principles. Also, it gives a sense of community. One of the mistakes of many libertarians and anarcho-capitalists is atomism, to think that we are individuals acting alone. That has a lot to do with neoclassicals, the Chicago school. They say we are an individual that maximizes, optimizes, always choosing according to their interests. That is not so. The human being is embedded in a community. In fact, you are only an individual in a community. You are Gustavo to people who know you. To the state, you are Gustavo Velasco plus a number, but it is not you, because it doesn't know how you like onions, how you like to dress, if you're in a good mood during mornings, whether you drive fast or slow. Those features that individualize you are only known by people who treat you. And to them, you are indeed an individual. To them, you're truly a differentiated person, for whatever characteristics. To the government, you're a name plus a number. You're not an individual, but rather a number on a list. But you can only develop your personality in a community environment, where the features that individualize you can be seen.
You have also stated that the state is one of the main enemies of the family. Why do you think that?
I could mention Alan Carlson. He's an American theorist who also wrote books about family. He explains that it's not exactly an enemy. The nation-building process, the state-building process, is a process in which it goes slowly terminating all institutions that can confront it, that can eclipse the state. Firstly, it finished with local powers. It also tries to finish with churches, right? It tries to finish with all the forces that can overshadow it, right? It finished with the nobility, for example, because it overshadowed it too. And regarding the family, it first finishes with extended family, right? And then I think, I don't know if it is deliberated or not, it may be an impulse, an inertia, that leads it to attack. In fact, initially, the person is more loyal to the family than to the state. For the moment, it remains to be so. It is rare for a son to report his father on tax evasion. It is rare. He is still more loyal to his family than to the state. He trusts his parents more than the state. So, that loyalty in certain cases can be conflictive because it prevents the state from penetrating society. That is why the state tries, from the cradle to the grave, as the British say, it tries to supplant them. It already supplants them during the education process, for instance. A good part of education is no longer a parent's matter, but a state or parastatal institutions matter who teach them a series of things. Then it takes care of the elderly when they are sick, and it takes care of us when we are sick through state institutions. You could look for different formulas to provide those services. That's what we try to discuss, whether there are alternatives of another kind. Not only the family, but civil society, other types of organizations. So the state wants to say, no, the state feeds you, educates you, takes care of you now that you are sick and old. So it tries to substitute and strengthen its ties. You can see it every day.
You have also claimed that the state attacks savings. Why do you think so?
It didn't always attack it. I'll talk about it now. It didn't always attack it. Nowadays, it attacks it in the sense that it takes independence away from you. From the moment you live day to day, you are state dependent. You have almost no element to forecast in order to attend your own matters. For example, inflation is one of the main enemies of savings. Inflation is an aberration that states created to create money and finance their expenses, or to finance their own power apparatus. So, if inflation is generated, savings are worth nothing. Taxes on savings, for instance. If you spend money out there partying, that's very well. That's called consumption. But if you save the money and invest it, they would tax you on the profit. Except they charge you twice, right? So it's not particularly a friend, and all the policies of central banks are almost always, at least in our field, condemned to punish savings. The state does not favor savings at all. It does not favor a savings culture. It used to before. It didn't always do this. I always say it. It is the very example of the state itself. The state, which is permanently in deficit, what is it telling citizens? Look at the state. The state spends and nothing happens. Spends more than what it has. And look, nothing happens. So you all do the same, right?
You have also asserted, and Hans Hermann Hoppe also does, the notion that monarchies were better than democracies.
If I remember correctly, what Hoppe explains is that in the monarchy, the state apparatus is one famili's private property. It is an apparatus, an organization, dedicated to extracting rent from society. But it's private property, and not anyone can become a member of the ruling party. Whereas in a republic, theoretically anyone can become the leader of that country. That's the catch. In one case, there is class awareness. In the other, there is no class awareness. If I'm aware that I cannot become, I wouldn't view those people the same way as if any citizen over 18 years old could become. Okay, then, run yourself. No, I can't run. So, it generates a consciousness of opposition that makes the state's power to stop. Part of Hoppe's thesis is that it introduces the concept of time, is one of the characteristics of the Austrian school, into politics. The more a ruler lasts, is it better or worse? Is it better to be changing every 4 years? Hoppe would ask, what's the difference between living in your own house versus renting one? Is the house equally taken care of? That is the question that Hoppe poses. The republic ruler is there as rented. He's in for a few years, doesn't know how long. He can be kicked out. The king knows it is his and is interested for it to prosper in the long run, not for love to the people, but to himself. Kingdoms or any state get more money if people are rich. They take a part away from the peoples. But if the people are rich, the king is also rich. If the people are poor, the king will also end up being poor. This is pure logic. A very poor people cannot have a very rich state. This is pure logic, right? If it extracts income out of the people through taxes and people have nothing, who do you take away from? It's interesting because Hoppe analyzes politics from a different standpoint, right? The king thinks long-term. This is mine. I will plant trees. I will see them grow. This will prosper. I will make my people prosper because I will also prosper. My capital goods, my organization. He doesn't say that is less bad, morally wise, a monarchy than a democracy. He just says that the consequences of one and the other are different. The king thinks of his property and wants it to prosper. The other says, I don't care. I'm here just 4 years. I care about getting as many resources as possible during the 4 years and then leave. So those aspects are what Hoppe studies.
But also, its consequences, right? For instance, you state in some lectures that a person, when he is in a democracy, can make very bad policies, and that there's no consequence. Instead, monarchies.
Right, but I'm stating that you're like a temp worker. If a government X ruins the country economically, leaves it with a huge deficit, destroys it with debt, deficit, inflation, nothing happens to the state official. But if the king does the same, he will end up poor. His income derives from what happens in the country. It's his business. Hoppe doesn't say that it is less bad. He says that the consequences as a lesser bad would tend to be one of these. Note that, in general, governments that think long-term tend to be more civilizers than the ones thinking short-term. They tend to be more responsible and the others more irresponsible because there's nothing at stake. It's what Taleb says in Skin of the Game. At the end, a democratic ruler has nothing at stake. Nothing at stake of his own while in government. He doesn't care whether the country does good or bad, except for his prestige, but there is no real incentive.
Moving on to current politics, Milei will come tomorrow. What do you think how he's doing in his administration? He's doing it well, economically.
Economically, he is making an adjustment, pretty hard adjustment. It's a pretty orthodox adjustment for current times. The thing is that Milei was straightforward. That's why he has so much support, and said, look, there's no money, and we'll make cuts, and there will be suffering, pain, cuts. But he didn't lie as most politicians do. This is a walk in the park. He didn't lie. If you tell people that they will have 1 or 2 years of a bad time, and you say, here's the solution for the country to do good, people accept it, and that's what he is doing. We'll see how he does on other fields. The problem with governing authorities, libertarians or not, is that everything is not enclosed on the economic field alone. There are more fields. Foreign policy, social policy, even internal debates that a country may have. It remains to be seen how he responds to that. You don't vote only on economy. Moreover, there is a problem. When people get used to do good, they forget that before they did bad and think it was always like this. So now any other arguments that he may have within the country, it can affect him. Economically wise, I think he's acting quite correctly, although it may seem hard. In fact, from what I'm reading, poverty rates lowered again. The country begins to stabilize economically. I do think he has the intention of following up on this. The thing is, it's not just one person governing. He has to have people surrounding him who are on board. It remains to be seen. I hope they are. And then there are more debatable issues, as Hoppe said, such as foreign policy, etc., if it's the right one or not, to align so much to certain countries, whether is right or not. So those things also affect him, not only the economy. Many governments don't fall due to the economy, they fall due to other things.
So then, what's your view on the situation in Spain? Do you really think there may be someone similar to Milei?
It is harder in the Spanish system. Milei has an advantage. It is Milei, and it was a choice between two. It was either Milei or Massa, a choice between two. Here, there is no choice between two. Here, you have to present a list with 350 people in each party and come out on the sites. That's the issue. This electoral system makes it harder. Actually, it makes it easy for them to appear. But for them to win is another matter. It takes a lot of time. For a political party that wants to be a bit solvent and stable, it needs like 20 years to purify itself, to learn to create its structure everywhere. A capillarity, we say, right? That has people, that has mayors, that has autonomous regional presidents, that has city councilors. And all that takes time. You cannot form a party and that's it. We've seen it in Spanish politics with several parties, right? You hit them and they cannot withstand because they don't have that capillarity. They are made from the top. So the head fails and that's it. So it's more difficult. I'm not saying it cannot be done. I'm saying that the system itself makes it difficult by taking up so much time and depending on calendars. What do I mean? Say that a party X comes out. I don't want to name anyone. I don't usually talk about politics nor critic anyone. Say there is a party that comes out as a libertarian, but it has 3 city councilors, and say the PP has 12 and can name the mayor. So do they do it or not? If they don't do it, is wrong. If they do it, they would start being part of the system. Therefore, losing purity and losing a series of things. It is very difficult to do it like this, right? Because at the end, you have to get involved in the political party system. You either endorse one or the others, by action or omission. Or say such party does not vote. Very well, but if that happens, Pedro Sanchez wins, for instance. So they will be asked to vote, right? But if they vote and endorse the PP, for instance, now they are PP's arm, PP's white brand, whatever. So it's difficult. It is very difficult through the Spanish electoral system to undergo major power shifts. Now, if it gets to stabilize itself, it is also easy to be stable for a long time.
Last question. What's your view on the MAGA movement? What's your view on the Trump administration? He hadn't done so many tariff projects in the past. Now we see he's done a lot of tariff projects.
I think it's too soon. In my opinion, obviously without having access of any kind. My opinion is that Trump uses tariffs as a negotiation weapon. I think he knows full well the damage tariffs do. They explained it to him and he also knows it full well, but he uses it as a political strategy. He threatens and in return he gets other types of terms or whatever he understands that favors the country. In that sense, I don't see him as aggressive as they said he'd be. In fact, before, he put a rather absurd tariff. I think he got to put 150% to China. Any businessman knows that from 1% up, tariffs are no longer needed. Trade is already eliminated. Above 100%, they'd no longer buy. There is no longer trade, right? 150, 200, or 1,000 is irrelevant. It seems he's using that. Then we'll see how he's impacted by internal problems which were also predictable. Within his movement, with his partners and Elon Musk, the things we are watching. It is still too soon to call how it will turn out. It may turn out very good or break the party or many things. Politics are often unpredictable. You cannot know. Anyone telling you he knows what will happen, he would be lying.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for your time.
Thank you.